So first of all, I'm really confused by Leo's presentation, because when I think about the forces that he's describing, I don't call them left. I call them liberal. And I think what's great about this book is I read it as a incredibly useful text to address liberal politics in the United States, and the way liberals, including Krugman and others, are proposing that we address the crisis. I think the most important point of their book in this regard is that they argue and they show really well that the crisis flows out of the dynamics of the capitalist system, especially new strategies of capitalist accumulation, that the policies leading up to the crisis, as well as the shape of the bailouts, don't reflect a distortion of the proper relationship between the state and the economy, or the state and the corporations, but instead they demonstrate that the U.S. government played a necessary and crucial role in forwarding and protecting a new phase of capitalist expansion that's represented by globalization. And the role of the state was not only in the way it, as Leo just described, structured the expansion and liberalization of the financial system, but also forwarded the rise of new technologies, supported new modes of organizing production, and most crucially, new forms of disciplining the working class that emerged in the 1980s and have been expanded and applied with great success since then. And so that in that sense, the state played a role that was a necessary role in terms of what the state's major goal, which is making sure that the American economy functioned as well as possible for the accumulation of capital and profit. So that, I think they do it very well, they do it very clearly and very effectively. So the second thing is that the analysis of the role of the state in the economy also discusses and begins to put forward, in terms of its assault on the working class, an explanation of why what's happened in this immediate time of the crisis in terms of the working class response. And there they use very effectively the example of the auto industry and show and critique the approach that the UAW is taking, and put forward and explain that this is part of, as you were saying, it's part of, so if we want to talk about the union rather than the left, and we want to talk about the Democratic Party rather than the left, then I think they make a really good case. And they offer a sort of suggestions for a different way of going forward. And then the last part of the book, they put forward, I think, a very interesting political program, and I'm particularly drawn to their call for us to do politics in what I would call a sort of more complicated way, where we really begin to shape our struggles such that we combine reforms that meet the immediate needs of people in terms of jobs, income, housing, and so forth, and services, and at the same time are shaping much broader demand that's integrated into it. So it's not a state, we have to get away from any kind of thing. Well, right now what we can do is this small reform, but someday in the future we should do something like nationalize the bank. So they call for a new way of doing politics, and I know that they're all involved in it, in trying to do this here in Toronto. And I think the book is, I really like that part of the book. So I'm going to raise a couple of questions. The first is a small question on their economic analysis. And they argue that financialization of the economy is not parasitic, again addressing liberals, but integral to corporate profit making, but has also been, because of and I would say not just the social movements, the decline of social movements, but also the decline of the unions, that working class people in the United States have had to survive through debt, right? So that means that there's been an integration of the working class into the financial system via debt, private pensions, home ownership, credit card debt, and so forth. My question is, how important is it now, or will it be in the future, of credit for hooking working class people into the system, given how stable and how unstable and insecure these strategies have proved to be? And I wonder how important they are, or will be in the future, in sort of retarding working class fight back. In fact, it seems to me that the whole argument in the States about this argument about reforming consumer credit, you know, they're kind of arguing, well, that would be a bad thing because, you know, we're just continuing to hook people into consumer credit. But I think one of the things that we can do, because it is something that's a very live issue right now, is begin to sort of use that as a first step toward raising this question and sort of explaining why consumer debt has ballooned. But a larger question I want to raise, and I hope I can be clear about this, because I have spent a lot of my time in the left listening, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but listening to men talk about the economy. And it's always incredibly passionate and incredibly interesting. But there's always this claim that how you understand the economy is a basis for the kinds of politics you put forward and the programs that you put forward. And I am just simply unconvinced of this. As I said at the beginning, I'm very convinced that their analysis, a Marxist analysis, a class analysis, is extremely important in terms of creating an alternative and being the basis of an alternative for a non-liberal politics. But I don't see, and I would challenge both, I would ask David as well, as somebody who's involved in this, as well as the authors, I am just not convinced that if you say that one of the sources of financialization was problems in profitability in the real economy, that you were inevitably going to be for a Tobin tax instead of a nationalizing the banks. I mean, you haven't convinced me of that at all. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to talk about is, do you have a few more minutes?
Yes, you do.
Okay, good.
And since now you put gender on the agenda,
Yeah.
I'll give you
Very good.
Okay. Another part of their book that I really like is in the political program part, when they focus on the sort of importance in the left of developing a politics around decommodification of working class life and labor. And they talk about, and then they go further, which I think is really important, to say that along with this decommodification, and I think there is right ground for this, even in the States, because people have been so battered by their dependence on this private economy that is just completely wrecking everyone's lives. And there's no doubt that the new phase is now an attack on the public sector, which in the States is going to be incredibly vicious. And it's going to also engage women's lives not only as workers in the public sector, but also in terms of the ways in which women are and families are, leaders of families are more engaged with aspects of with many of the public sector services. So here I think that what they're also saying, which I like, is that not only do we have to defend the public sector, but we also have to talk about democratizing the state and democratizing the way the public sector operates. And actually there's been really interesting experiments going on around how to accomplish this, and I think that that's something that the left really should focus more on. My only reservation in this is about their program, is I think they, of course, should have focused more of the politics of this effort around issues of care. They talk about public infrastructure. Three areas are public pensions, public infrastructure, and health care. But I think that schools and daycare are going to be another place where we're seeing cutbacks and assault, and I think that's another thing that should be part of the program. I also think that the issue of democratizing is extremely important because, as Helen Colley raised in one of her sessions, is that neoliberal alternatives to the state, so part of this attack on the state is we can't afford it, but the other is we can deliver services in another way through cooperatives, through NGOs, all of which, of course, are staffed by flexibilized workers, low-paid workers, who, and that's why they're cheap. So, but they also have had a lot of purchase politically because they are organized. They're contrasted to, they're smaller, they're not bureaucratized, they're more accessible, and also they're part of this sort of more, of kind of liberal multiculturalism, that they can be more effective to meet a variety of needs. So it's important for the left that we much more fully develop our discourses around democratizing government, democratizing the state and public services. And also they make a point, which I think is great, which I love people to talk about. And you see, I'm really focusing on the politics here because that's what I think is so important. I think it's also, of course, important that we understand the system that we're up against. But I really like their political stuff very, very well. And especially, as I say, as an alternative to liberal thinking. They also talk about the importance of democratizing the unions as part of developing an effective working class response, and they talk about this in terms of the auto sector, but also more generally, and I think that is really also true, the idea that the unions have to become much more representative of broader social movement unionism. But let me just raise two things then. So those are all the things I like. But I have a question about in their program. You guys make this huge. You say the nationalization of the bank of the banking system is where you think that that's really important. And yet you're very critical of things like the Tobin tax, because like the Tobin tax is sort of just says, well, let's get money out of this crazy buying and selling of stocks that goes on all the time, right? No, and not the Tobin tax, the one that where you tax stocks. What is that?
Yeah, it's very responsive turnover tax.
Yeah, turnover taxes, right? Yeah. And again, it seems to me that sort of violates your own proposals for how to carry out our struggles, because you sort of say, well, we have to start with things that, that are about regulating, and in this case, regulating in the interest of refinancing the state. Seems to me a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And to say that what we need to go further, that it's not enough to just try to skim off from the volatility of the system, but what we really need to do is begin to start taking control of the financial system itself and making that a public utility in the same way we should be having other kinds of public utilities. In our state, in Oregon, some people are organizing about creating a state bank, and I'm curious about what you think about that as a sort of effective strategy. And lastly, I want to say something about the environment. We're always kind of tacking the environment on, but as I watch the oil pouring into the Gulf of Mexico, I'm really beginning to feel that we are quickly approaching a dual crisis. There, where, as David said in his address, in his remarks of Friday night, that we can expect a 10 years, a decade of a crisis, of assaults on the working class, and therefore the possibility of a growing realization that the system needs fundamental reforming. And I think we and Sam and others They talk about this, but I think for us, we should really pay attention to that little piece in their book and think about developing it, because I don't think we have to find ways to talk about these twin crises together at the same time and constantly be making the links, so that when we're talking about, you know, the sort of gutting and hollowing out of people's lives through this sort of assault on the working class as a result of this crisis, we should also be talking about that these are the same forces that are hollowing out the environment.
I'll try to keep my comments fairly focused and brief, and start by saying that this book has all the characteristic strengths that one would expect from the work that Leo and Greg and Sam have been doing over the years, which is to say it is rooted in very closely attended to concrete empirical analyses, as opposed to proceeding from a set of theoretical propositions to which the world ought to conform. And I think one of the strengths of the work that Leo and Greg and Sam have been doing over the years is to try to really begin with the actual reconfigurations on the ground in terms of class relations, capital, labor, and so on. And all of that just rings through in the book. Similarly, the clarity with which they write. This is an accessible text. This is something that you can use in a lot of different fora as a way to discuss many of the issues around the crisis. And let's be honest, that's still too rare on the left, that there's that, we're writing with that kind of clarity and accessibility. Similarly, I think that the way in which they look at neoliberalism as involving a transformation in class relations. There's a shift in class and social power, which is at the key, which is at the heart of neoliberalism, which then makes possible a new dynamism of capitalism for a period of time. Gets us out of what I find to be fairly unhelpful notions that we've been in a crisis for 40 years. We've been in a long downturn for decades and decades and decades. I think they grasp some of what has been new about the neoliberal period, the dynamic tendencies and so on. Similarly, I think that one of the contributions that they have been consistently making is to locate finance, and they all spoke to this in different ways, but to locate finance not as a certain kind of left populist discourse has it, as a purely parasitic phenomenon, leeching off the system, but in fact, central to the reorganization of capitalist profitability, that financial markets start to discipline firms and workers in a more persistent, consistent way than ever before in this period. That everything, the stock valuations, the ownership structures, the factories that get investments, the wage levels and so on, are increasingly being policed by financial markets. So that rather than seeing it as parasitic, they see it, I think, as a central focus of the restructuring of capital. I just see that as a real contribution, something that we need to build upon and extend. It's no secret I've quibbled with Leo and Sam that sometimes I think it gets a little too seamless, and that some of the contradictions there, I think, need to be highlighted more sometimes, but there's the strength of what they're doing can't be denied in that regard. But it does raise for me a couple of sets of issues as we then move into understanding the crisis and left responses. And I guess I'll set it up this way. I'll say, I think I see a couple of tensions that I want to push on and see how the authors would like to respond to. And the first, does, Sam restated it, is the proposition that the crisis is rooted in the dynamics of finance. And I think I want to kind of offer a yes and no and see how you respond to it. In other words, I think once you say that finance is absolutely integral to all the circuits of capitalist accumulation, as all three of you rightly do, and you insist on trying to break down the distinction between finance and the real economy, there is a tendency then to read back and say, oh, it's just a financial crisis, when you've in fact insisted on it to us on the need to break down the distinction. And I think that the financial crisis in some ways speaks to a broader crisis of capitalist accumulation. And that we have to be, well, I agree with Sam, that corporations were in much stronger position in terms of their debt loads going into this crisis than, say, the crisis of the 70s. I think we've got to be careful about the profit figures in the massive credit buildup of the last Greenspan period, which is to say from about 2001 onwards. I think corporations are booking a lot of fictitious profits during this period. There's a kind of Enron phenomenon where they're literally valuing assets based on asset bubbles and then booking profits. And I think the profits are more vulnerable during this period. I think that the restoration of profitability has peaked by around 97, and it's getting more precarious. And I think, in fact, we need to see, in other words, those, if you will, in quotes, the real economy dimensions as well. Not just in auto, but in the housing and construction sectors and so on. There's just massive overbuilding and overaccumulation. So I did want to press on that point. And then secondly, because I think there's something really rich in the way that Leo, Greg, and Sam are talking about some new possible openings for left politics, I also want to press a little bit on a point there. And here I'll just briefly pick up on two passages, because I think there's this really suggestive formulation that comes in the book. For those of you who either have it or want to check it out later, it's on page 99, where they talk about the need to envision new kinds of union campaigns linking public sector workers and communities, producers and users, in opposition to neoliberalism. And I think Johanna was speaking to this. I just see this as really significant. This idea of thinking beyond, if you will, the limits of either trade unionism, which thinks it's just about the producers, a kind of narrow business unionism that doesn't think about the users of social services and how they ought to be brought into alliances, what I would call working class alliances, involving community-based organizing and workplace-based organizing. I think that's really important, that this idea, and would be extremely helpful to the way we think about what the left ought to be doing during this period of crisis, which is it's coming simultaneously on public employees and on the actual social services that are provided. And then, where I think there's at least a potential tension that I want to press on, is when 20 pages later, they talk about the need to work among the different segments of the working class and gain a deeper understanding of how to build class unity across communities and gender and racial divisions. And I think what I'd like to say here is, because we live with histories on the left, I think to really make the compelling case here that we, all of us, including the authors of the book, have to be prepared to problematize, if I will, the older language of class unity, in which it appeared to be that gender-based demands based around the needs of communities of color and so on, weren't about class and weren't about class unity. I don't think that's where they want to go. I think this talk about building links between communities and working class organizations means precisely that. We need to be foregrounding. Johanna talked about the politics of care in here and at more length in her presentation and on the open plenary, for the specifically kinds of gendered issues that talking about public services provision raises, the differential impacts of the crisis on communities of color, and so on. And I think that's a way to open up this idea of producers and users, communities and workplace organizing, and so on, in richer ways, which then allow us to project precisely what I think our authors want to talk about in terms of socialist, feminist, anti-racist, working class politics, which are specifically sort of thematizing the concrete needs that arise out of different kinds of communities, working class communities and constituencies. So I might have to press you on basically saying that working class unity has to be kind of spelled out, I think, in ways that attend to some of the problems of past language and the needs to introduce that discourse in ways that are highly sensitive to those histories. I'll stop there.
Thank you to both of the responders.
I really like Johanna's point about economics and politics. Politics not being determined by economics. People can have good economics and have lousy politics. You can also have the problem of people having good politics. You can have good politics and then try to structure your economics so you come to conclusions that help that politics. But I think you're absolutely right about that. What should I focus on? Let me just give a couple of examples in terms of what David was pressing us on, in terms of what does it actually concretely mean to build some class unity in the public-private sector relationships. Through the Toronto Workers' Assembly, which we've gotten underway, and we're trying to build some relationships by defining class in the much broader ways that David's talking about. We're actually having a forum on June 19th on healthcare, but it's structured completely so that the workers would come there to strategize about their relationships to the community. Groups like OCAP and STOP are going to be part of that, emphasize that healthcare isn't just something that's about the healthcare system, but it's about food and poverty. So they'll be directly integrated into not just attending, but making presentations. So we're trying to think through how you do that, because I suspect getting around this question of how do class, gender, and race intersect, we can clarify it theoretically, but it really is going to come out of some practice that shows that you mean it. It's actually easy to state it just in the abstract. Let me just say something very quickly on this question of the relationship between finance and industry, which I think we're still trying to work out and clarify. But I guess the way I would answer it is that if you're trying to understand the liberalization of finance, you can't understand it except in terms of a response to the previous crisis. So it was a response to a very real crisis that was based on a profit squeeze and things going on in the real economy. This leads to a liberalization of finance, and finance becomes so powerful, in fact, it's integrated into capitalism, but it is so powerful institutionally that it actually does have a degree of autonomy that you can study. You have to study it in this larger context, but you actually have to take a look at finance in terms of the details of how it works and the contradictions. And as those contradictions work through, they intersect with the real economy and influence it, which we've obviously seen in this crisis. So I guess that's how I would try to answer the point about finance being part of the real economy, yet having to be understood in terms of a degree of autonomy that's developed that you can analyze. The other point I just want to emphasize really strongly, and I think Johanna and David really pointed to this, we have to understand neoliberalism is not just an attack on the working class, but as integrating the working class in particular ways. And one of the things we don't often talk about is time. The most important factor of how working people sustain their income through the 80s and 90s wasn't debt. It was the hours of work they provided, which in the United States was overwhelmingly women's work. It wasn't women coming into the workforce, it was women in the workforce working 8 hours, ending up to be working full-time. And the implication of that is a higher level of exploitation, but the biggest political implication is a lack of time. It really poses the question of if you're going to be politically active and you can't exploit your partner to do it, how are we going to find the time to be working and doing the daily chores of living and actually find time for political work? Now, the other point on credit to understand is we sometimes think of this in terms of the credit was essential to keep capitalism going. I'd really qualify that, and this will be more controversial. One is that the corporations actually were earning, the point about the exploitation and the high productivity that was going on and the stagnating wages was that they were very profitable. They actually didn't need to borrow money to invest. Their integration into financial circuits was more about the services that were provided, arbitrage, than the fact that they needed it. So that's one part of downplaying some of the credit argument. And with the working class, it's the social integration that's been so fundamental in the financial. Not just the fact that you're borrowing money, but if you have a home, the home becomes an asset. If you've got a retirement income, that becomes an asset. So you're always doing calculations. Even if you're just using your credit card and paying it off each month, you're always doing calculations on what your assets are, where you can get some income from, and that's, I think, the social integration has been crucial. One of the points about borrowing money all the time is you also have to pay it back. When you actually look at the period from 83 to 99 and you say how much of the sustaining and consumption was coming from working class credit, it's not that high. The money that they borrow, they also have to pay back, so the net impact of credit wasn't that high. A lot of the increased consumption comes from the fact that the rich can consume an awful lot, and the hours. And then I think the credit. Where credit's really important is mortgages. I just want to say something very quickly about the bank question and strategy. The point of making it clear that nationalizing the banks is essential, it doesn't solve the problem. Even if you nationalize the banks, you have to ask, what are you going to do with it? If you're just going to use it to strengthen private capital, you're not doing anything with it. But the point of linking the present and the future is that we have to actually start talking about that now. It isn't going to come out of trying to think of small strategies that don't raise the question of nationalization, because that's too radical. You'll never get there. And the difficulty with people who try to raise the question of what's a modest strategy to get it on the agenda is that becomes a strategy. It becomes a diversion. It's as if a co-op bank is a way you don't have to cope with the real power of capital or taxing. I wanted to say something about computers, but maybe Gregor will.
Johanna mentioned the discussion of green alternatives and the program. And in the text, we mainly focus on it vis-a-vis the infrastructure component. But I think most of us have written on this, or I have in particular, but in the wider sense. But where it fits in the program, right now, the left, I think, is in two senses. One is the critique of the cap-and-trade systems and the way that they've been formed in Kyoto and Copenhagen. I think that's a fundamental critique to it, and the solution to environmental crisis being more financialization. But the problem is also that those financializations for the cap-and-trade haven't worked. So it's at least better that we would defend arguments around the carbon taxes. But even then, I think the mistake that's come from the left, which is part a result of the environmental movement not being articulated to the left in the way it's split over the last decade, especially in North America, towards market ecology, has meant that the traditional demands of the left are in fact the best greenhouse gas reduction strategy. That is work time reduction, expansion of collective services, income redistribution, public transit. Some of the core demands of the left are the best greenhouse gas reduction strategy. And I think that's kind of a crucial part. And then we should be talking about, as we were vis-a-vis the infrastructure spending and technological conversion, then that enters at that level, not beginning with the technology. In fact, I think we should be beginning with those traditional demands as the essential point. I think around the focus on gender, I think one of the reasons for that aspect vis-a-vis the public sector and the struggle around the public sector, its relationship to gender is absolutely central. Partly even the workers there, the leadership in these unions are often females. The attack on public sector workers in Canada and North America is especially an attack on female workers. And it's about those services provision, which tends to be many of the public sector services are related to that range of healthcare issues that are being cut, daycare that obviously is being delayed, the jacking up of the daycare fees in Quebec, as an example. All those relate a lot to gender issues. And I think that is absolutely crucial for the defense of the public sector right now. And when one looks at the alliances that have to be struck in dealing with the austerity drive right now, you immediately have to move beyond those workers to the services and users that you're providing, because you're having to defend that work. And to defend that work means the users have to be engaged in the defense of that work, which is reaching out in a new way. When you do that, it's important to see that you're doing that. You are immediately having to speak about neoliberalism and engage in a critique of neoliberalism and build political alliances about that. When you do that, the next question Sam has just argued over the weekend in an article he's written, is you then have to start asking about then the alternative ways you will deal with provision. It's just a logical chain, and David's quite right. When we think about those new community union alliances, I think that's exactly what the left has to be bringing in particular to this fight back around the public sector cuts and pushing then those sets of questions. It's important that we be engaged in that because the response that is mainly happening inside the union right now is a relatively conservative one. That is forming relatively smaller alliances inside the union leadership alone to see what deals can be cut to make sure that the damage is the least possible. And pushing at these new alliances will provide an alternative political space around those issues.
Yeah, just a few comments.
Yeah.
Just to say, first of all, that I think that the information technology revolution was enormously important in determining that the crisis of the 70s didn't lead to an interruption of capitalist internationalizing tendencies in a number of senses, not least in the sense of the way it facilitated the development of derivatives markets. It was essential to it. But also in the sense that it was one of the bases for the reconstruction or the reconstitution of the material base of American empire. Whatever we look at in terms of gross profitability, the remarkable thing is the extent to which the high-tech revolution remains one which is centered in its leading areas of biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, information technology, especially the production of the means of production in the United States. And that is very, very important, I think, to understanding the dynamism of things going on. Now, I would say that there's some disagreements amongst us probably. I think I disagree with Sam somewhat on this. I think that working class consumption was enormously important to keep the thing going. I think the fact that they repay doesn't mean that what they're doing with their repaying is buying the right to get deeper and deeper into debt. And that consumption was essential. I'm not saying the ruling classes can't consume a lot, but it's not just a matter of adding up the gross figures on what's adding to total consumption. I think working class consumption was crucial to sustaining all of this. And I would like to ask the question, I don't think we know the answer, whether what David's pressing for isn't right, that we may be well-facing, not so much because of declining profits, which are very hard to measure, but because of underconsumption, a long period of stagnation. That is, insofar as the public sector is being targeted, and insofar as working classes aren't able to roll over their credit and aren't able to sustain the one asset they have, their homes, as a means of extracting credit for consumption, can we expect the North American working classes and the European working classes to play the kind of role they did in sustaining this dynamic capitalism? I think that Johanna's absolutely right to say that there is no socialist strategy, let alone a good one, that derives out of an argument over whether you have a falling rate of profit. I couldn't agree more, and one of the reasons that Sam and I started doing this stuff was out of a strong reaction against that debate, which we felt was academic, and in the worst sense of the word, for that very reason. I couldn't agree more with that. That said, I think something also has to be said about those people who are so into strategy and building alliances and so on. And I think that above all, those of us who have stressed the need for working class organizations to overcome the inherent racism and sexism that lies deep in the way working classes are constructed in capitalism, is that we also have to turn that around. What I was getting at when I referred to the left, Johanna, what was in my mind was ACORN, which I think has been a remarkable organization going back to the 70s and winning days, and now been destroyed in the wake of this crisis. But ACORN was an organization which very much was important in fostering the Community Reinvestment Act in 1978, in winning via the Left Democratic Congress, let black working class women have more access to credit. And it seems to me incumbent on the left, not only to speak to the unions and say, be more aware of the needs of black women, it also becomes incumbent upon the left to go to those organizations that organize black women and say, here's why you need to be socialists. Here's how capitalism is operating in a way so that if you are fighting for a reform that will end banks' discrimination vis-a-vis you, you may be deepening your problem. And I also think that applies to the gay movement. I think it is very important to raise socialist questions and issues inside it. And that will involve producing splits within it because it's a very, very class-diverse movement. Extremely class-diverse. So, I just think we need, if we're going to be serious about this, we need to be serious at every level.
Okay, and on this note,
Serious lunch.
yeah, maybe we need to think of other issues like war and stuff. But